Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bound. If you're tuning into this show on the day of transmission, Monday the 3rd of June, then you'll be listening exactly 100 years after the death of the writer and unlikely literary megastar Franz Kafka. Kafka is one of those names to conjure with, like Camus and Proust, writers who also dealt with matters existential and infernally personal, and to whom the world believes it owes a great creative debt, but perhaps the world isn't quite sure what that debt is, or why it is owed. How Kafkaesque. Perhaps it's because Kafka is such a rewarding writer, despite being so elusive. Kafka is tempting, his work is possessed of warm shallows that suddenly give way to icy depths. But it's not as if us literary bathers weren't warned. There are danger signs from the get-go. What other novelist would have a young man wake up one morning turned into a giant bug? What other artist would have his protagonist arrested, sentenced and committed to prison for an unspecified crime bang at the start of a story? Who other than Kafka would invent a castle that a man can't get into to apply for the paperwork to be able to live in the place that he's already living in? Makes you shudder. By turns surreal, maddening, nightmarish and very funny, Kafka's novels did many things first. In fact, he was a writer of firsts right up until his untimely death from tuberculosis in his hometown of Prague at the age of 40, 100 years ago. So on this show, we celebrate Kafka in two ways. Firstly, by way of his unexpurgated diaries that have recently been translated into English for the first time, so we'll explore Kafka through those pages. And secondly, an anthology of Kafkaesque short stories has just been published too. Titled A Cage Went in Search of a Bird, it's a wonderful collection, and we'll be speaking to the screenwriter and short story writer Charlie Kaufman to get a line on how one might follow in Kafka's footsteps. 29 minutes on Kafka then are coming right up here on Monocle on Culture. So let's start with those diaries described by the writer, critic and friend of the show, Chris Power. Recently, while in hospital, Chris read Kafka's diaries to review them for The Guardian. It's a big book that leaves few stones unturned. Spending so much time in the company of the great man, I asked Chris how he found Kafka's bedside manner.
I found it actually incredibly gratifying. I really loved spending the best part of a month in his company. I must say I was in hospital for 33 days, and the number of doctors who would look at this huge tome of the diaries, I think it's a 600-page book, and they'd say, why the hell are you reading Kafka? Like, why aren't you reading P.G. Wodehouse or something? They were appalled. They almost wanted to take it away from me as a sort of medical intervention. Yeah, I found it really, I think because obviously he has a reputation, which we can get onto, but the diaries are really extraordinary and sort of penetrating this mystique that surrounds him and which the work encourages.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's nice to know that Britain's doctors have the wherewithal to treat patients and to do a bit of literary criticism on the side, even if it's just in the form of raising eyebrows, Chris. I suppose we all know, all professionals in that realm kind of probably know the sort of perverse reality and kind of bureaucratic nightmarishness of some of what we call Kafkaesque, I suppose, as well. And on that term has been used rightly and wrongly since his death, I suppose. What do you understand Kafkaesque to mean?
I suppose I understand it to mean, well, losing at base level, I suppose, in that the sort of typical Kafka protagonist is someone who is sort of is fighting against the tide and losing that battle. And I think an important part of the Kafkaesque, as you say, it's a quite misused and abused term, I think, but an important factor of it or element of it is this idea of sort of jurisdictions that we don't necessarily understand, a sort of legal overlay being applied to someone's life, maddening bureaucracy, labyrinthine customs or demands that we don't understand. Dream logic as well is a very important part of it. But really, yes, at base level, that sense that whatever you're trying to do or trying to achieve, you're being confounded at every turn.
And as a novelist and as a writer, he was prescient. I mean, the late 20th century loves him because he foresaw the craziness of Nazism, or the cruelty of Nazism, and the craziness of Stalin's communism, I suppose. But writers love him. What about you, as a writer yourself? What is it, other than his prescience, what are the qualities that you love so much?
I think that, he is one of those writers who sort of gives different things to you at different ages. I think a lot of people read him first as a teenager, and he sort of chimes with their sort of cynicism about the world, that the world is some sort of, or the grown-up world or the mainstream world is some sort of inimical plot that's just there to kind of trap us and prevent us from being who we want to be or who we can be. And I think as you get older, I think the work kind of, or certainly in terms of me, and it may be just that I was an incredibly shallow teenager, but the work seemed to deepen, and become more, I don't know, to take on elements of tragedy and elements of farce. He is a very funny writer, and I think that's apparently, and I'm not a German speaker, but apparently even more clear, or he's even funnier in German, which isn't a sentence you get to say very often. But apparently, he has just such a deadpan, very unadorned style, which I think in German in particular is quite unusual and sort of highlights the absurdity of some of his writing. And there's quite a lot of slapstick in his writing, actually, which he was a big, before he started to really get ill from TB, which was in 1917, he used to go to the movies a lot and would see these films that had a lot of slapstick in them. And I thought that sort of spilled over into his work. But I think he appeals so much to writers because his texts are incredibly open in the sense that the reader brings a lot to them. They're very open to interpretation. I mean, you talked about him sort of being written about as, yes, foreseeing the gas chambers and foreseeing totalitarianism. I mean, interestingly, he was sort of argued over by East and West, because some, in the West would write in an ideological sense that, yes, he was, look at the trial, look at the castle, this is Stalinism, to a T. And some intellectuals in the East were sort of saying that his work sort of foretells the alienation that's at the heart of capitalism. And I think you can see, you could quite easily make arguments for his work sort of chiming with the sort of dystopia of social media today. So he's a writer who, has never finished saying what he has to say, and that was Italo Calvino's definition of a classic. So I think he's a true classic in that sense. Yeah,
you used a phrase in this Guardian piece that's so lovely, and you used the phrase radical interpretability of his work, and it really is that there, as you say, because the German that he wrote in originally is so spare. Again, mine's not good enough, although we studied this in German at school because it was kind of easy to understand, but obviously then reading The Castle in German makes you think, yes, this is a bit like school.
Well, you say that easy to understand. I quoted Nabokov in the piece because he talks about this limpidity of his prose, sort of highlighting or accentuating I think he calls it the rich darkness of his fantasy. So, you've got these incredibly rich and strange ideas, but presented in a very, very matter-of-fact way, which is a really compelling juxtaposition.
That Gregor Samsa can simply wake up as a bug and just regard his own little tiny limbs twiddling around in his duvet and his sheets and blankets falling off because of the size of his body. It's just insane, and it is done with such a sort of straight face. And there's something about that, as you say, there is something very funny about his stuff that is, I think, often maybe, well, you can tell me, Chris, but overlooked, I suppose. And I understand this comes out in the diaries, his sort of impishness and some of his habits that were written out by Brod, right?
Yeah, I mean, Max Brod, who is a great friend of his, and, and we do owe a lot to, because, he didn't burn all of Kafka's papers as Kafka requested that he do. after his death in 1924. In fact, sort of the next year, the trial came out, and then The Castle, then The Man Who Disappeared, and so on. But Brod did have an agenda, and he did edit Kafka's works, and in particular the diaries. He really bowdlerized them. I mean, he took a lot of stuff out. He took out everything to do with sort of Kafka's visits to sex workers and Kafka's sort of homoerotic musings. This is the Swedish leg. Yeah, there are a couple of Swedish tourists that Kafka was admiring, the male Swedish tourists, and admiring the tautness of their leg muscles. And I think he wrote something like, it's all one can do to not run one's tongue along them, and musing on the size of another train passenger's member, a sort of bulge in his pants. And, you know, Brod didn't want any of this in there, because Brod sort of wanted to promote Kafka as a religious thinker, really. And he presented the novels as sort of religious parables, which you know, got discounted fairly early on. But it wasn't until 1990 that in Germany this unexpurgated edition of the diaries was published that we can now read in English. And there you get a much better sense of Kafka kind of in the round. You know, sometimes he's sort of, sounds quite helpless and naive. At other times he sounds, you know, he really has sort of wisdom beyond his years. He can be very funny. He can be very depressed. You know, he was suicidal at various times in his life. But you get this, you know, real sense of him as a person, which is quite unusual, because for so long he's been, like you say, he transcends just being a writer's writer. He's someone who's David Bowie quotes in Ashes to Ashes, or, you know, there was a great post-punk band, Joseph K, named after one of his most famous heroes. But he's also a tea towel and a mug and a fridge magnet, and he's on that level of fame which very few writers kind of rise to, and that makes it easy to sort of lose touch with the fact that he was a real person, that he was a civil servant who was falling in and out of love, having these disastrous affairs, and sort of struggling to write while he was trapped in a job that he actually got some satisfaction from, but mostly sort of resented for keeping him away from the desk. So all of that comes out in the diaries, which is what makes it such a pleasurable experience to read.
That was the writer Chris Power, and you can read more of his thoughts on Kafka on the Guardian website now. And Diaries by Franz Kafka is also out now, published by Penguin Classics.
Confect's summer issue is our annual travel special. Come with us on a road trip in southern Portugal. Discover the wild beauty of the Italian island of Pantelleria and browse elegant looks that will take you from beach to restaurant. In our hotel special, we'll be off-grid in Andalusia. We'll be discovering the rarefied beauty of a revived neo-Venetian hotel in Capri, and we'll be strolling in the Swiss Alps. In design, we'll visit a workshop crafting the iconic German Strandkorb, and we'll step inside a modernist forest home in the Spanish mountains. Our fashion pages will journey to Beirut to meet designer Rim Beydoun. We'll crisscross the island of Mallorca visiting ateliers, and we'll head to the Aegean and the Athenian Riviera to showcase the chic summer looks that will inspire your holiday wardrobe. Find the beauty in every season and subscribe to 4 editions of Confect today. Visit confectmagazine.com to sign up.
Welcome to the land of wine, cuisine, fashion, and the art of joie de vivre. France, the Monocle Handbook, is the 3rd installment in our series of hardback guides for the best things to do, see and discover in all corners of l'Hexagone. Over 220-plus pages, Monocle's latest book showcases the crème de la crème of the country, from the Atlantic to the Alps and the windswept Normandy to the sun-kissed Riviera. Plus, top tables in Paris, Nantes not-to-miss hotels, and where to splash out in Marseille, and plenty more to try from piste to plage. If you're looking to stay longer or put down roots, the book also spotlights the neighbourhoods to know and introduce you to the plucky entrepreneurs who have already made the move. France, the Monocle Handbook is out now. Buy your copy today at monocle.com/books.
Part 2 of our carnival of Kafka now. A book of short stories has just been published in time for that centenary of Kafka's death. Titled A Cage Went in Search of a Bird, it features 10 Kafkaesque tales from the likes of Ali Smith, Yi-Yun Lee and Naomi Alderman. Charlie Kaufman, the mind behind mind-bending movies such as Being John Malkovich, Synecdoche and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, also wrote a funny, weird story and spoke to me about it and Kafka. I began by asking Charlie what tone and feel came to mind when he was asked to write a Kafkaesque story.
I didn't have a story in mind when I was approached, and I sort of struggled, as I think I always do, trying to determine what the tone would be. So I played around with a lot of things, tried to sort of think about if I wanted to make it feel like Kafka, or if I wanted to maybe sort of have it through my own lens. And I thought that was better. I didn't want to do a parody. I didn't want to do something that was like, okay, I'm imitating Kafka. So I started to think about the things that interested me about Kafka's work when I first read it, which was when I was a teenager. And I think the dreaminess of it, of the sense of being lost in a situation, trying to understand the world that you're in and what it's asking of you, and ultimately not being able to. So that's what I was playing with.
Yeah, and there always seems to be in Kafka, and this is how your story kind of takes flight. There's a bit like an episode of Quantum Leap where Sam is just always dropped into a scenario and has to figure out the language and the people around him. And this is exactly what happens in your story, if I may say so. That's how it seems to me. And it's a beguiling place to begin. It starts with a character called I, who seems to be a writer of some sort, and he's being questioned by an interviewer on stage with other people at a book signing or a reading. I guess this is close to Kafka's heart, close to your heart, perhaps, Charlie.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about this morning, and maybe for the first time it occurred to me, because I was thinking about the trial, and it occurred to me, I wonder what happened to Joseph K. before the trial. Was his life different, or was it a series of these things? And I think I understood it to be, it was kind of normal until this point, but I don't know. It seems odd that he would suddenly be thrust into the situation. So I was thinking about that with my character as well. And so you said Quantum Leap, and he's dropped into this story and has to sort of make sense of it. I think that's pretty accurate.
And I guess also such a Kafkaesque thing or a theme in Kafka's stories is the punishment seems to come first. We witness to the punishment or the sentencing, and then we and through the characters' actions and words and their interior life understand what on earth it was that this poor guy did. And we go on a story, it seems, mostly at night with I, the character of your story.
Yeah, so, he's written a book, and he's doing the reading, as you said, and the person who's moderating the conversation is reading an excerpt from his book, and he realizes that he doesn't recognize anything that she's reading, and he doesn't believe that he wrote it. In fact, he thinks she's trying to sort of prank him. But eventually he realizes when he looks at the book, the excerpt, that he did write it, and he doesn't understand even what it means. And the rest of the story follows him through that reading on his way home, and everything is new to him and strange to him and unrecognizable to him, including his apartment.
And he's incapable of being definitive, I suppose. Everything is coming at him to kind of fast traffic lights on a road at night. It seems that life is coming at him like this. He finds himself in this situation. And this is something that's so wonderful to draw on the wellspring of Kafka. It's just something you've done, I believe, in the way that he can only imagine things and think things and guess things. And you say that, he walks past a cafe on the corner and it was open until 11 a.m., he supposed. And it would probably be his favourite cafe, he believed. He's incapable of being definitive about what might well be the habits and tenets of his own life.
Yeah, and it's unclear if that sort of attitude comes from what preceded it, which is that he didn't write this book that he supposedly wrote. So everything would be up for grabs after that. He doesn't know who he is, and he's at sea. And I kind of feel that way often. What is it that makes me me? Am I attached to my opinions and beliefs? Is it something that I grab onto because I need to have some sort of identity to understand myself, or am I really this person that I present to the world?
Charlie, I don't want to be too punctilious about this idea of notion of the Kafkaesque, because obviously the subtitle to this great collection, A Cage Went in Search of a Bird, for which you've written a story, but it's not subtitled 10 stories that inspired by Franz Kafka or the work of Franz Kafka. There's something specific about Kafkaesque that seems to exist way above and beyond the writings of Franz Kafka. Is that true, or have we just been taking that Kafkaesque idea for a walk for a century or so?
I don't know. I had to throw it out. I felt like I can't attach myself to this Kafkaesque thing. I just have to write a story. And I guess my stuff has been compared to Kafka's. So I figured, well, if I write a story, then they can compare it to Kafka and I'll be safe. But it's mine. Obviously, I was influenced by him. He was important to me when I was young. And so I figured it'll just be what it'll be.
Yes, your screenplays and the whole atmosphere of a lot of the stuff that you've written and that has made it onto the big screen, Charlie, has been attributed that sort of epithet of Kafkaesque. I guess you know why, but does that put you in a box? Is that a trial of its own, I wonder?
I mean, I've heard it and I recognize it. I don't try for it. I don't think my stuff is really like Kafka's, but I do think that maybe I tend to try to write from the irrational and dream logic. And I think that there is that feeling in Kafka, or at least that's my feeling from Kafka, that he captures something that feels very dreamy. I intentionally do that because it frees me, allows me to sort of think outside of this quote-unquote naturalist box. But yeah, I don't know.
No, it's a funny one, isn't it? I guess it can be a little bit like the title of this collection. It can be like A Cage in Search of a Bird, I suppose, when everything has this sort of heavy epithet about it, or this sort of potentially heavy character. But as someone that read Kafka as a teenager, and now you're writing, and I wonder how, when you read him back now, if you do, and he always seems like a writer that's relevant and has been sadly prescient in a lot of the things that happened in the 20th century, that happened after his death. How do you read him now? Does it mean, clearly things mean differently as we read them at different ages, but I wonder how you look at those pages when you turn the pages of Kafka.
Oddly, I haven't read Kafka in a very long time, so I don't know what my experience would be now. I did read the Blue Octavo notebooks, which Anna Kelly, who's the editor of this collection, said we could use as inspiration or even take quotes from. So I read that, and I do reference it within this story. I don't know if I have a different impression of Kafka than I might have when I was a teenager. My impression when I was young was that the world was mysterious and you couldn't find it, and that it was very funny, even though the circumstances seemed kind of awful and tragic. I liked the comedy in it, and that's what I was drawn to. I imagine I would still be drawn to that.
Yeah, and I think the comedy has been rereadings of Kafka. I think that people have tried to bring out the comedy and feel that that's lacking, because I think he himself thought his stuff was side-splittingly funny. And sometimes we read it with, obviously, through the heavy lens of some of the parts of the 20th century, but it wasn't intended to be that way at the time, I suppose.
Well, I think it can be both. I think things can be funny and deadly serious, and I think that's how I read Kafka. And when I was a kid and I read it, and I thought it was funny, and then I read the thing that you just said, that Kafka would do readings of this, and he would be laughing as he was doing it. I felt somehow vindicated, because it's not conspicuously funny, it's dry. I think that when I did the movie Synecdoche, New York, I was, in a way, maybe trying for that. And I feel pleased when people don't know that that's a comedy, because it's so clearly a comedy to me, but I'm not pointing to that. And I felt proud that I accomplished this subtle thing.
And the cast of characters that sit around perhaps he's a writer, perhaps he's not, in your story, Charlie, they're brilliant and bizarre and beautifully drawn a little array of 5 or 6 sort of other characters. Where did they come from? Because, I mean, I love any short story or any story that simply has the person depicting themselves as an imposter in a Peter Pan collar. But tell us about the rest of the cast of characters a little bit. I mean, I love them, and I wonder whether they seem to be very specific for you. Maybe they've come directly from Kafka.
No, they haven't come from Kafka at all. I was sort of like trying to figure out where to place this story and what it was going to be about, and I happened to go to a reading, and it inspired me. There were not those people at the reading, but there was something about the reading and the interaction between the novelist and the person who was interviewing him that felt really off. And so I decided that it would be interesting for me to place it at an event like that. And then I was just trying to think of characters rather than people, so that it sort of felt populated by people who you might find in a play or something. And a friend of mine told me that I often put sailors in the audience of things that I write, and apparently I did that here too. Sometimes I do things I don't even know that I'm repeating myself, but I did a pilot several years ago that didn't get picked up for series that had a sailor in the audience of a children's science show, so sort of a seedy sailor.
I like that this is a strange recurring theme that you don't even know is sort of happening. You need other people to point it out. I think this is.
Yes, there's a lot of that in my work.
Yeah, exactly. It's great, though. I wonder how you feel, just finally, with the character in your story in this collection, that actually his sort of ignorance of his own story and life and what he has and hasn't said and who he has and hasn't married or what he does and doesn't like to eat and whether he has or hasn't written this book. Does that set him free, I wonder, or is that just only a troubling thing? I feel like he might, after we reach the point on the end of your story, Charlie, that we could take that story anywhere. I feel like it might set him free, this ignorance of his own.
Interesting. I think it could if he were the type of person who would be set free by that. And he may be, because it is left open at the end. But I feel like he is lost in this world, and he needs those identifiers in order to exist. He needs to be this person who does this, who's written this, who's married to this, who likes this. I think if he could evolve past that it might be freeing, but I don't think he's there.
And that is all for this week. My thanks to Chris Power and Charlie Kaufman there. A Cage Went in Search of a Bird, 10 Kafkaesque Stories is out now, published by Abacus. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bound, thanks for tuning in.